Hey listeners, I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and I'm excited to have you joining us for episode 660 of the show. This week we are rebroadcasting our interview with Dr. Rupal Patel, originally published on July 27th of 2015. Listeners, Rupal is conducting amazing interdisciplinary research to better understand speech prosody, which is the melody in our speech, and also to design new speech enhancement and speech learning technologies for people with speech impairments. These include developing novel human-machine assistive communication interfaces, both for use in her lab and also in a voice AI startup company called Vocal ID. Now, listeners, Rupal shares great stories about her life and her science during our conversation. So get ready to be inspired with this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Rupal Patel. So thank you, Rupal, so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Wonderful. We are excited to chat with you today in our interview. But first, I want to introduce you to our listeners. So listeners, just a touch of background here. Rupal is a professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders, as well as the College of Computer and Information Science at Northeastern University. She's also the director of the Communication Analysis and Design Laboratory and a co-founder and core faculty member of the interdisciplinary doctoral program in Personal Health Informatics there. Now, Rupal received her bachelor's in science and neuropsychology from the University of Calgary and her master's in health science and her Ph.D. in speech language pathology from the University of Toronto. Afterwards, Rupal completed postdoctoral research at MIT, and she served as a faculty member at Columbia University before joining the faculty at Northeastern, where she is today. And now Rupal has joined us today to tell us about her journey through life and science. So Rupal, today we want to get to know you, not only as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start off this interview by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not doing science?
When I'm not doing science, I love spending time with my family. I've got two wonderful kids, an almost 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, and they both keep me busy. They keep me entertained. They keep me on my toes, and their ideas are fascinating, and the way they interpret the world, it's just such a pleasure to be around.
That's awesome. Well, fantastic to hear about how you spend your time when you're not doing science. I know spending quality time with the family is a great way to escape from the stress of the lab sometimes. So that is perfect.
Yes. And sometimes it's even science with them. So learning about the way they perceive something. I mean, I've gotten some of my best ideas, and actually some of the best quotes I have are from my kids. So I think that the way kids perceive the world is fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, and I think just maintaining almost that closeness with the childlike curiosity is key to getting some of those inspirational ideas in science. So great point there. But now I want to chat a little bit more about your science, Rupal. Can you tell us how you describe what you do at work to someone who might not be familiar with science?
Sure. I study how people talk and how something as simple as speaking is sometimes difficult for some people. And so it comes so naturally for us. But for some people whose muscular control isn't the same as yours and mine, or whose neurodevelopment isn't the same, is quite challenging. So speech production is actually one of the most coordinated movement acts that our body does. And I study that, how it happens naturally, and how individuals who have no disability are able to produce speech so efficiently and so well. And when that goes wrong in terms of something around the time of birth or even later in life, some trauma to the brain that then impairs speech production. So I study how speech is produced and how it breaks down. And I also study in those extreme cases when speech is not a viable mode of communication, how we can use computers to mediate communication. So in general, I study communication, but specifically I try to use voice and speech as a modality for interacting with computers if someone cannot use their natural speech at all.
Well, very, very cool. I'm looking forward to chatting more about the details of your research as we go through. And I know I'm going to be having a hard time not to be analyzing my speech as we're going through this, but can we take a pit stop here and talk about motivation? I think scientists have so much work they want to get done a day. It often helps to have these little quotes or saying little things to keep you going. So do you have a favorite motivational or inspirational quote, Rupal?
This is a tough one. There's so many different quotes for different kinds of things that kind of get you through what your challenges are. But I think part of who I am and part of the things that I think about often are, is there a way to do something better? And if there is, I'm going to find it. I think it's a quote by Edison, there's always a way to do things better, find it. And I think it's kind of the engineering sort of mindset of no matter how well something is engineered or built, there's always a way to refine it and to improve it and to change it.
Well, I love that quote, and I am a perfectionist myself. So I know even if I feel like I did a good job on something, I always want to be doing better. So that is a great quote. Now, can you tell us next about some of the people who may have inspired you or maybe had a big impact on you as you've gone through this scientific journey?
I've had a lot of different role models, and the role models have been for different aspects of what I think make me the scientist I am or the person I am today. And I feel like in some ways my mom is a great role model in the sense that she's always thinking about how to be a better person and how to be kind and good to people. I had also a fantastic mentor during my early years in graduate school, the chair of our department, who always had kind of a very starry-eyed and very kind of forward-looking future vision. And I think that that's really important, that you're not only talking or thinking about your science today, but you're thinking about your science in the future. And then I also think about people that are more global leaders that have inspired me in terms of just thinking not only about your tiny silo of the research, but like thinking kind of broader how you can impact the world around you. So I struggle with thinking about only one role model because I feel like there's different people in your life that kind of influence different aspects of who you are.
Definitely. Well, I think you brought up some really great examples of the kinds of role models that you can have along the way. And wonderful to hear that you had such a great role model in the family and your mother. So did she encourage you then to pursue an interest in science? Was this one of the people who nurtured your curiosity?
I don't think in any explicit way, no. In fact, I had a very well-known uncle. I didn't see him that much, but often when I did see him, he had these nuggets of truth. And what he would say to me is things like, don't ever stop at feeling like good enough is okay. Push yourself to expecting more of yourself because there's only one chance you have to live life, right? And you want to live it to the fullest and you want to be able to feel like you made the biggest contribution. So my mom would never say these things out loud to me like my uncle would. Mm-hmm. But I think for her, it was more subtle things that she would say and just always being extremely positive about stuff. But in terms of concrete things that pushing me in science, I think that often came from inside. Like I had a science teacher in grade 6, Mr. Beatty. Actually, I was a very shy kid at that time. I just recently moved from Africa to Canada, and he really saw that I loved science, and he understood what it was that was driving me. It was the curiosity of finding out whether the bean sprout grows the longest with the light and so on and so forth. And I probably was one of the quietest people in this class, but he noticed that in me, and he gave me the science award in grade 6. And to me, that internal or external gratification about science sort of is the way I started seeing myself. I think all it takes is one person to recognize you as having a particular ability. And if you can internalize that and use that as your power, I think that's really what it takes. Often it's someone who finds you. And in this case, it was a teacher who sort of found what turned me on in the world. It was that curiosity.
Well, Rupal, I love this story, and it totally resonates with me. I was in a similar boat where I was sort of the shy, quiet kid in school, but loved science. And I think my science teachers picked up on it as well. And I think that can make all the difference, having that person early on notice that you're interested and foster that. So awesome. So did you ever go back and tell Mr. Beatty the impact that he had on you?
I didn't. I had an art teacher who had a similar impact on my life where he understood why I liked art because it was building things or the kind of art that I did, which is sculpture. And I went back to talk to him, but I did not go back to talk to Mr. Beatty. And now I kind of regret it. Yeah. Maybe one day I will. I don't live anywhere close to there anymore. But it is interesting. I think that this goes to what we think of our teachers or professors and like how they impact you like later in life. But teachers early on in life, when they see that light bulb go off, they are the spark, because that's when I think you're forming your identity of how you want to perceive yourself in the world and how you want others to perceive you and to expect things from you.
Absolutely. And I think now, for myself at least, being on the other side of it, now being an instructor and teaching students, I'm like, wow, I really didn't appreciate how much work they were putting into it. Now I'm also regretting not having gone back and telling people how much of a great job they did. So,
yeah.
Well, listeners, make sure you take advantage of it if you're still there. So, well, Rupal, wonderful to hear about how your beginnings in science really sparked that curiosity in grade school, having that fantastic teacher. But now, can you tell us a little bit about what were some of these key events then that took you from this curious student to where you are today? What are some of these key turning point moments?
So my journey in terms of the career I have today, or the kinds of things I'm studying today, are so nonlinear. And I didn't even know the field of speech pathology even existed. I didn't have any speech therapy as a kid or any of those things. And then also in terms of how computers can be used for helping people to communicate, I'd never experienced that in my life. So I think what happens is often if you leave yourself open to the kinds of things that can help steer you where you go. Maybe life isn't only about following a particular path. It's actually about following the path that most excites you. So I moved when I was 8 from Zambia to Canada, to a very, very small town. Mm-hmm. And it sort of began there where my British accent from Zambia was not interpreted very well by this tiny town of 1,000 people. And I was stuck in resource room help for reading because I read in whole word reading, or I was taught to read whole word, and my teacher's expectations that I would be doing phonetic reading. And so there I was sort of put aside and sort of treated like I didn't understand what was happening. And my parents, being not traditional, but like expecting that the teacher knows what they're talking about, thought also that maybe I was struggling with reading. And It was very hard because I was always a good student. All of a sudden now I'm being treated very differently because I pronounce words differently or because I'm not following the curriculum in a particular way. And that for me was, when I look back, a lot of the impetus to pushing myself was, I don't want to be in that category. I'm not in that category of needing support. And so then after a year later, we moved to a bigger town and people understood better, like that people have accents and so on and so forth. And many, many years later, when I was getting ready to go to college, I was very interested in communication and people. And I studied psychology, but I still didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. My parents had expectations that I was going to go to medical school, and I kind of tried that out my first year of college, didn't really like all of that. I wanted a broader education, and so I studied economics, I studied psychology, and what really was turning me on was like thinking about the brain. I really was fascinated by neuroscience, but I still didn't know what I wanted to be. And then my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, was talking to me about this. I like building things a lot. I was always into building toys. I was also into designing my clothes. I designed a lot of my clothes that I wore in high school.
Oh, wow.
Tangible stuff was really important to me. So my brother-in-law said to me, why don't you come with me and observe a speech pathologist and an occupational therapist and a physical therapist and learn about these fields that are allied health medicine, but they also have a lot of personal contact with people because you like talking to people. Mm-hmm. And so that was kind of what spurred me into thinking about speech pathology. And I really connected with what the field of speech science and speech pathology was all about. Then I went on to do some volunteer work with people with head injuries and learned that there's even a profession called speech language pathology. And so that was kind of the first turning point for me. Second turning point was while I was in graduate school for speech language pathology, I learned about something called speech recognition research, or speech recognition. And there I had observed some people with spinal cord injury using speech recognition as a mode of communication. And I was just fascinated by this technology. So much so that when I became a speech pathologist and worked in the field, I was really interested to see if people who had severe speech disorders, who couldn't be understood by everyday people, but whose parents and familiar caregivers seemed to be understanding them when they were in their vicinity, I thought, could we not use a speech recognition system to recognize these people, just because their patterns of speech is relatively clear? So a couple of years after, I went back to school and tried to learn more about speech recognition and thought I could build a speech recognition system for people with speech disorder, and soon learned that was a slightly naive way of looking at how that technology worked. And then my Ph.D. was more along the lines of figuring out what was consistent in someone's speech. So there's so many serendipitous things that happen. And many, many years later, after I finished my Ph.D., I was at a conference and I saw a little girl and a grown man having a conversation using different devices, but the same voice. And I was struck by the fact that there's a little girl using an adult male voice, and I wanted to do something about that. That gave rise to a research project in my laboratory, and that's actually now spun out into a company. So there are many things that if you are really spurring your interest and curiosity, when you pay attention to those things, because all of these things are happening on a daily basis, and it's only when you look back that you realize that they're turning points. I think in everyday life, you don't realize that an aha moment has happened to you. It's not like that.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to identify when you're at one of these forks in the road and there is this big opportunity in front of you. I think sometimes you overlook it when you're in the moment, but when you look back, of course, hindsight is 20/20. So
that's right.
Well, Rupal, I think you brought up so many great points. I love this description that you have of that internal drive that kept you going and this theme coming through of you following your passion, following what you were interested in, even if you didn't exactly know where that was going to take you down the line. And I'd like to chat a little bit about this company if you're willing to chat about it, just to hear about how you got it started and how you balance that with your academic commitments.
Absolutely. So back in December 2013, I had the privilege to speak at TED Women about this, what was then a research project. And basically the research project was about how do you build unique voices for people who cannot speak, who use computerized devices to speak. So take someone like Stephen Hawking. He uses a generic synthetic voice, and that same voice may also be used by a little girl or a woman. And what my research had shown is that people who have very severe speech disorders still continue to vocalize, especially with people that they're familiar with. And those vocalizations are distinct and they have a unique quality to them. And so what's preserved in their voice is something that actually could be used to tailor a unique voice. So with years of funding from the National Science Foundation, we were able to create some techniques where we could take a tiny sample of someone who has a very severe speech impairment, but they can still sustain a vowel-like production for a few seconds. We can take that sound and blend it with a database of recordings from someone who is matched in age and gender and size and language history and so on and so forth, and create a unique voice that sounds like the donor in terms of clarity, but is similar in vocal identity to the recipient.
That is so cool.
So I described this project then. At the very end of my talk, I said, what if people around the world could donate their voice to someone in need? And at that time, I had no idea how many people would be interested in this. And it was actually a last minute kind of idea that I put into the talk that I'd been practicing for months. And like a week before I left for the talk, I had added in these visuals where I showed people from around the world donating their voice to someone in need. And within the first month, we had a few thousand people start to sign up to want to be voice donors. And we had no way to collect voice samples like that.
That is awesome.
Yeah, it was just so exciting and terrifying because we had no plan about how to make this happen. So the talk came out in February. By March or April, there were thousands of people wanting to be voice donors. We had no platform for it whatsoever. And then about May of 2014, I decided to actually form the company and put in some seed investment to start to actually collect people's voices, build a platform to do that. And that's exactly what we did last year. And that time there was some balancing. I wrote some grants last summer to spin out the company. And in January, I took leave from the university because it's very difficult to do this while managing a research lab.
Sure.
So I'm currently on leave from the university, and I'm grateful to the university for giving me the opportunity to pursue this and to really allow this technology to be experienced in the lives of those individuals who really need it.
Well, this is phenomenal. So are you still looking for voice donors?
Absolutely, yes.
Long right, listeners, your call to action. So where should people go if they want to donate their voice?
They go to www.vocalid, that's vocalid.co/voicebank.
Well, this is a phenomenal project. So when you started this, did you ever envision that it might turn into this company, this whole large endeavor?
No, and I think that when you're in the midst of something, you don't realize what it is, right? So when we were in the lab building these voices, we had a technique for how to create a voice, but we didn't have a voice bank. We had a few people that we had some recordings of their speech, and we were really perfecting the way to blend the voices. But really, it was that TED Talk that even got me thinking about what is the call to action for people who are watching this, because most people do not run into individuals who have communication disorders, even though there are 2.5 million Americans who use a text-to-speech synthesizer to communicate. There's a lot of people who have text-to-speech needs. You take someone who has autism, who points at a symbol system because they're nonverbal and must communicate through the computer. Someone with cerebral palsy who doesn't have enough muscular control must use a communication system to communicate. People with stroke, people with ALS. There are millions of people out there, but we don't necessarily see them because their worlds are much more complicated than ours, and they're not necessarily able to experience the kind of communication that we can so freely with speech.
Certainly. Well, Rupal, this has been fantastic to hear about your journey. Now, this is a really exciting project. Is there another project that you wanted to chat about?
This is what I'm most excited about right now. There's other work that's going on in my lab that's also really exciting. We've been working for a while on an application to help children read out loud with more melody, because all of our work is about the melody of speech. And so that's the particular aspect of speech that we study. So we built a computer program that allows typically developing children to read out loud with more expression. And that's actually actually goes back to the story I told you earlier when I was sent to resource room help when I was a little kid for reading differently. And what came to me, actually observing my niece, I was visiting her once and she was reading to me very sort of staccato, word by word fashion initially, and which was typical for a 7-year-old. And then a few days later, she was reciting a poem to me and was doing this with absolute beautiful melody and intonation patterns. And I kept sort of probing her all weekend long when I was visiting her, saying, how is it that you can do the poem so differently, as if a 7-year-old is supposed to give me the answer?
Right.
But finally, what I realized is that the teacher had taught her how to read the poem, the cadence of the poem, the intonation of the poem. Mm-hmm. And she could memorize that as a 7-year-old, smart 7-year-old. So what I realized is that when we read out loud, there are no cues in the text that tell us how to read. We know how to break down the words, or we learn how to break down the words, and we're taught about that. We know when to use a rising intonation and so on and so forth, but we're not really taught within an utterance how to read the words out loud. And so we built a tool which gives you visual cues to the melody of speech as you're reading a piece of text. And it's kind of like training wheels. So it shows you the melody in the pitch contour, the loudness, the how you're supposed to stretch out the words, and which words require stretching out not to be emphatic. And then slowly you don't have to have these cues anymore because prosody or this melody of speech is typically learned. But early on, if we don't give kids that kind of scaffolding, they don't learn how to read expressively. And there's fourth graders in this country who do not read expressively. And when they don't read expressively, they don't understand what they've read out loud. So it's really important for comprehension.
Definitely. Well, it has been phenomenal to hear more about the work that you're doing. And I think this intonation, this talking with emotion, having this prosody is something that you sort of take for granted on a daily basis. I mean, I think we've all had that professor or seen the sort of Ben Stein clips of the very monotonic professor teaching. And I think this is something that it's not just maybe children who are having this struggle where they just like don't talk with emotion. So is this something where you look outside of people with obvious disabilities, or are there milder forms of it that you might see in a normal population?
Yeah, I mean, we call the program Reading Karaoke, and Reading Karaoke has been of interest to typically developing children just learning how to read, but also there's applications for second language learners. If you speak Spanish, you don't know what the intonation contours are like for English. They differ. In addition, there's applications for individuals on the autism spectrum who sometimes are very flat, also people who are depressed. There's a lot of applications for speaking with greater melody and inflection that go from public speaking all the way to comprehension in grade schoolers.
Sure. Well, very cool to hear about these projects. But I think so far, Rupal, we've talked about all of the exciting moments along your career journey, and we haven't yet hit any of the troughs, any of the stumbling blocks. But I think every scientist goes through tough times, probably more than one of them. So can you think back now on the course of your career and share with us one of these difficult moments where you faced a big challenge, or maybe you had a major failure, and tell us what happened and how you recovered to become successful?
I think there's many different kinds of experiences. I'll tell you about a couple of different ones. Universities these days, the focus often is on the balance between teaching and research. And research is often the thing that's valued so much, right? You've got to get those grants to make sure that the lab is funded.
Right.
And teaching is important, but it's not always the primary focus. And I think that balance is sometimes hard to accomplish. And so one of the things I'll talk about is really trying to find that rhythm and making sure that you integrate the research into the teaching. And so I think early on, I remember struggling with that, finding that balance between being able to continue the research on and feeling that the teaching was something that I had to do, even though I loved doing it. And I didn't want it to be something I had to do. I wanted it to be something I loved doing. And so when I started incorporating more of the research into my teaching, I think that's where it kind of was easier to do. Another kind of stumbling block or challenge, there was an R01 I was writing, sort of a big research grant that was a little too pie in the sky. And we wrote it 3 different times, and we had pretty successful research grants in the past. And all of a sudden we had like 3 times when this research grants that I thought were the best. I'd spent the entire summer writing them,
oh, wow,
which was agonizing. And it was sort of the best projects that we'd written up and most sort of far reaching in terms of impact on science. And the first one came back not even reviewed. It came back triaged, meaning that a few people read it, but it never went to a discussion. So we revised it and did all these things, everything that they said to do to it, and came back again, and it came back again, triage.
Oh, no.
I'm like, how can this happen? Second summer in a row that you're throwing down the toilet to write the
right, slaving away.
And what is going on? And meanwhile, we're still getting other grants, so it's still some of the other stuff is being funded. So it's not dire straits, but this was some of the theoretical work that we really wanted to push the boundaries on. And it was one of my mentors that said to me, Rupal, sometimes if you're too far out there, if things are so far in the future, people just don't know how to understand it or interpret it. And I think that that was good advice. And so what we ended up doing is breaking up that grant into smaller pieces. And all of those smaller pieces got funded. So in the end, everything worked out. But gosh, you had to stick to it and you had to continue to believe in the idea. And I had to continue to have my graduate students believe in the idea and put in a stronger effort the next time. And how do you keep doing that and feeling like sometimes you do need to back off of an idea and say that people aren't ready for this, we can't do this, because I think being too headstrong doesn't work either. But you have to have this balance of pushing a limit, but also knowing what is going to necessarily work. And no one knows how a grant is going to get interpreted. So that was, I think, a challenge. Some of the other challenges sometimes are interpersonal. A recent challenge that I had was actually a student that was very, very strong initially. And then there were hurdles in her own career that led to turning the tables on what was happening in the lab. And that was just a very negative experience for the lab. And I'd never experienced that in 15 years. So I had to kind of step in there and we talked about it openly. And that was tough. And when you're going through it, it was not something I'd experienced before. Lab culture has always been extremely strong and one where my students all keep in touch with each other. They email me, they write me about their babies and families and so on. So there's a network of people over time. I think that sometimes you can attribute a lot of this to you, but as a lab manager and as a lab director, sometimes it is in your control, other times it's not. And you have to act in ways that sometimes you don't want to. I don't expect to be babysitting my students. I'm dealing with a university where there's undergraduates and graduates all the way to postdocs. So I want them to take control of their lives. But sometimes you do have to step in and say, well, this isn't the culture that I want. And that was the struggle.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so glad you brought up all these different examples of different kinds of struggles and challenges. And I think the grant one is one that a lot of people are familiar with. A lot of people are struggling with just in general trying to get funding. But I really like this twist that you have on the example of having this big pie in the sky idea, as you call it, something that you're really passionate about, but it just might be too early for it. And I think that happens so often in science. I think people might not even be aware of this triage process, like you said, where no one even really discussed your grant. It was just sort of dismissed and sent back to you after, like you said, a whole summer, 3 long months of work. So how did you get the motivation to go back and try again? What kept you from just scrapping that idea and moving on to something new?
You have to really believe in the idea. If you can't convince yourself, you can't convince others. The fundamental idea here was that people who have congenital impairments from birth would have a slightly different way of perceiving their speech production as well as producing their speech because they've had this impairment from birth. And that those who have impairments later on in life are going to be different because they've already acquired the understanding of speech melody from an early age. So this has never been talked about in terms of that there could be almost 2 different ways to look at the disorder that's being manifest, the final sort of production impairment. And just everything was telling me in my gut that there is this difference. Now we have to investigate that further. So I guess partly it's just the desire and the curiosity to learn that I don't know. I'm going to have to convince you some other way. If you didn't hear me the first time, maybe I didn't say it right. I don't know. But I feel like you have to believe in the idea, right? So it was convincing. It was conversations, and some of them were like, do we really want to try this again? So we tried a slightly different approach, like I said, where we did make it more piecemeal, and we did decide to break up the project into littler pieces that potentially were more digestible by others.
Absolutely. Well, I think a great approach, kind of break it up, more bite-sized pieces there. So fantastic to hear about how you work through these different kinds of challenges. But we don't just want to talk about the difficult times in your career, Rupal. Can you tell us next about one of your success stories? And this can be a big success or even a little victory.
The freshest step in my mind right now is what we're doing with Vocal ID. And recently we were awarded this innovation prize by South by Southwest for the health med and biotech innovation. And there's big companies that are already doing a lot of work in this area. And as a startup, we were awarded the innovation prize for 2014. And I had no expectations. I knew we were nominated for that and another category. but I had no idea that we were going to win it. And it was really exciting. And I think the big success for me was when my son came up to me when he heard about the story and he said, "Mommy, I'm really proud of you. You're doing something that's really going to help people in the world."
Oh my goodness. That's a heart melter.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah. And so it was a success in terms of the work, but it was a success to know that all of what I'm doing is being understood and respected and infused into the lives of two people whose approval I want so much. So it was really special.
Well, that is so exciting, Rupal. Thank you for sharing that story of success with us today. And so exciting that your research is able to have a big impact on people. I think that's phenomenal. And I know we chatted just a little bit in the beginning of our interview about life outside of science. And I know a lot of scientists are able to occupy their time, perhaps escaping from the literature for a little while for some fun reading. So I love to chat with scientists that we have on our program about the books that they've read. So can you share with us today what you would consider one of your favorite books?
I haven't read a book in a long time, I feel like, because I've been reading all these other things. I've been reading a lot of business books lately and things of that sort. One of my favorite books was The Alchemist. I really liked that book. I liked how there's a lot of life story in there. There's stuff about struggle. It's just a really interesting book that way. And if I can give you one other book, The 20th Wife. I loved reading this book. This is a book that's about the Mughal Empire and this queen, I guess. What I loved about the book is just such an escape from today's world. And it was just fascinating to read it and think about a powerful woman in that period of time and how she yielded power and how she commanded the attention of all these different people, and both with pitfalls as well as her successes. I just loved it.
Well, that sounds like a glowing endorsement and an excellent recommendation. So, Rupal, I will put these out on our website for our listeners to find if they are in search of their next great read. And I'm always excited to add some to my list as well. So these sound fantastic. And now, one thing that we haven't yet chatted about is one of the great aspects of careers in science, the opportunity to travel. I think you get to go to so many places to share your research, to work with different people. So can you think back on your career and tell us about one of these travel experiences that just left a huge impact on you?
I love Barcelona. I had a conference in Barcelona a few years ago, and I love that city, fell in love with it. And it wasn't so much about the science or what I did there. I gave a talk there actually on some aspects of vocal ID, but it was exploring the city later on. That was fascinating. So it's got this inner center to it that's just so interesting, and then this outer center where I ended up staying after the conference was finished. My husband was traveling with me then too, because it was one of our wedding anniversaries. And we were able to see a part of Barcelona that's not the typical part. It was very touristy. And so it was really great to sort of feel like you were living there. We just recently went back there again and stayed at the same hotel with our kids.
Oh, wow.
It was great to be back there again. I love it. I love that city.
That was awesome. So what was your kids' favorite places while they were there?
We went to a tiny town called Hun outside of Granada. And in Granada, we went to the Alhambra, which I think has left a lifetime of impression on both of them.
Well, this sounds like a phenomenal travel opportunity. And I think great to hear that you were able to take some time out. I think scientists get to travel for work quite a bit of the time, but you hear these stories about people who never get to leave the conference hall. And I think it is important to get outside, to explore a city, get exposed to a new culture. So great to hear that you did that. And I love talking about these travel opportunities, getting able to travel vicariously through different people to all the places they've been. But I also like to hear about the people you've been able to work with. And we've shared some different stories of these phenomenal people who you've had a chance to work with throughout your career. And I think this really is one of the great aspects of science. There are so many creative, funny, wonderful people that you get to work with. And I think all these different research groups that you work with kind of develop their own personalities, and they often have lots of traditions that go along with them, or just funny memories that you can look back on when you were there. So can you share one of these memories with us today of the human side of science that might be different from some of the stereotypes about scientists that are out there now?
I think that different labs have different traditions, and I think some labs have a tradition of sort of going out on a Friday afternoon and sharing a drink. That's not part of our lab, but we have birthday celebrations. We've done a bunch of different kinds of things like that. One year, we had to move our entire lab from where we are to a dormitory on campus because there was some asbestos in the building.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and I was actually pregnant with my son at the time. So there were dollies full of our equipment that was being moved into a dormitory for the summer. My students at that time, I had a smaller group then, but we all gathered together. We talked about the things that we're going to move together. And then we decided that we were going to keep in the dormitory. We had 2 rooms and then a common area that was kind of our suite that we were going to have. Mm-hmm. So we decided that we were going to have meetings in the bigger common room area, and we were going to stock the fridge with all sorts of different food. And that was fine by me because I was 7 months pregnant and always wanted something to eat. So we stacked it with different healthy foods, and I would come in with nuts every day because I love nuts. And I would have these fruits and nuts was our snacks. So we'd sit together and eat lunch together. And it was just one of these things where you could look at it as a huge hardship to have the entire lab to be moved. But it was actually one of the most fun moments I remember of the lab, where we were a tight-knit group that was experiencing stuff together, including one mouse attack that we saw, which wasn't so much fun, but
oh my goodness.
It was fun. It was a fun summer.
Well, this sounds awesome. It sounds like you really took the opportunity to make, like you said, one of these challenging situations, something that a lot of people would look at through a pessimistic lens, and really made it a fun bonding experience for the whole group. I think that's awesome.
It was great.
Well, it sounds like a lot of fun. And I love hearing about these different science memories and really, like I said, highlighting that human side of science and all the fun things that you get to do as part of a science career. I know scientists work so hard on the work that they're doing, but you like to go out and have fun too. You're people as well. So one of the things we love to emphasize on our program. And we've chatted a little bit about your research and some of the amazing questions that you're working on in the lab. But I want to now stretch our minds a little bit further, Rupal. Can you think now about the big questions that you want to answer? And if I gave you everything, if things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility were not a problem, what is the one question that you are just dying to know the answer to?
If there's a way for the brain to relearn how to speak, what's the best and most efficient way to do that?
I like that question. So what do you think is standing in our way now?
There's two things. I think we don't know enough about how the brain works in terms of speech production. And I think we also don't know how technology can necessarily replicate that or emulate that or facilitate that. I think there's questions on both sides, on the basic science side as well as on the applied. How do we build systems that kind of become a fusion between brain and body?
That is a phenomenal question to think about. I love talking about these big questions because I think it's so easy in science to get your focus so narrow, focusing on these things that you think will get funded, these questions, kind of limiting yourself too much, that you don't always get the opportunity to think big. So great question there, Rupal. And one thing that we've mentioned throughout this interview are some of the opportunities you've had to work with great people. Specifically, you pointed out some of your mentors, and I think there are a lot of opportunities to get great advice as a scientist along different points of your career. So I'm wondering if you could share with us today what you would consider the best piece of advice is that you've ever received.
Yeah, I think we talked about this earlier, is not stopping at good enough, always asking sort of further questions. Also thinking outside the box and thinking outside of your discipline. So oftentimes there's an idea or a concept or a process that has been thought about in a different way in a different discipline. And I think walking outside of your discipline and trying to see how that's done there gives you great ideas, and sometimes as much as just transplanting the idea into your discipline. So I feel a lot of what I've been doing lately is looking at different ways in people have solved problems in a different field. It could be architecture. So when you look at how a building is built, it may actually have some similarities to how the speech production mechanism works when it has multiple different kinds of pieces that have to work together. So you can get insights into your field from other fields, and often it's in the conversations that you have in the interstitial spaces that you'll learn much more than you will necessarily in just going deeper in one area. So the answers to all your questions are not in a textbook. They're in fact in conversations with others, and it's getting outside of your space and outside of your comfort zone. Also, I feel like sometimes people come in with preconceived notions, feeling like there's a particular field that they're not good at or they don't know well enough. The example typically is like mathematics or physics or something. It feels daunting to people. But there are ways to even break down the most daunting tasks into smaller little bits. And I've learned from many of my mentors is that go and talk to them, talk to experts, because the experts actually know how to talk about their field sometimes in ways that are digestible. Not everyone, but some people are really quite talented in being able to tell you at least like a layperson's version of what they do. And that will help you interpret and be less scared of digging deeper in that.
Well, very well said, Rupal. And I love this idea of thinking interdisciplinarily and really emphasizing a breadth of knowledge and working with different people across the lines of fields, which I think often turn into silos. And I think you're in an interesting position. So you have a joint appointment across more the communication sciences and disorders and also the computer information system. So was this a challenge, being able to speak the lingo in both of those different worlds?
Yes, and I think it's come over time. So initially I was always just fully in communication sciences and disorders, formerly known as speech language pathology. And then a few years ago, 5 years ago now, I worked with a couple of colleagues to create the Personal Health Informatics program at Northeastern University, a doctoral program. And as we were working on this, and my research is very interdisciplinary, always funded through National Science Foundation's Computer Science Division. My students came from both engineering and computer science and speech science. So we were already doing this work, and that was when the university was expanding its scope to hiring people across disciplines. And actually, during that time, my role became then joint appointed, and that was after I had tenure. So it was good to do it after tenure, and I would warn people against having interdisciplinary roles prior to tenure, because I think that you can't be in multiple disciplines simultaneously in terms of building a tenure case. So it takes time to build this. You can think about it more as building blocks rather than from the beginning kind of pulling everything together, because it takes time to establish those relationships. It takes time to be known in those areas, and you're still always going to have a primary field that you're known better in than another.
Definitely. I think you made some great points there and important considerations for people who might be in the academic pathway, considering these joint appointments and trying to think strategically about it. So yeah, great points there.
I know the world is going toward interdisciplinary, and it's important, I think, to do, but I think we haven't figured out in the traditional academic model how to deal with that for things like tenure.
Right. It is a logistical consideration for sure. Well, great points. And it's been phenomenal to talk to you about your work and about your career experiences, Rupal. Now, is there any last note of advice or any last piece of inspiration that you would like to end our interview on, a message to leave to our listeners?
No, this has been exciting. I mean, I think that I've been speaking a lot lately to all girls schools and even just young people who are actually donating their voices to us. And so we have this whole group of people around the world doing voice drives for us. And the big theme that I keep telling them about is that a career in science is so different depending on which scientific foray you go down. Science is so broad. What I'm doing today in terms of speech pathology or speech science is so different than maybe what I learned about 15, 20 years ago. And so really you have the opportunity to change your definition of science and to mold it to what you want it to be. For young girls, my takeaway often is that if you want to change the world, science is a career. There's a path for you. It's not about beakers and mixing chemicals only, although that's a perfectly fine science as well. But there's so many dimensions of what science is and what math is. We use math, we use science and our technology to build voices for people. So very social cause, but driven by science. So I think science is the key to experiencing your curiosity. And I think that I'd encourage parents to talk to their kids about science in different ways and not think about it as a thing that is kind of hard. It can be soft and hard and everything in between.
Well, I love it, Rupal. Wonderful note to end on here. Now, can you tell our listeners how they can reach out if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Sure. You can find out more about my research lab at www.cadlab, which is CADLAB.NEU.edu, and there's research projects there that are various different research projects that are archived as well as ongoing work, because that research lab is continuing to thrive and pull out the work that we've been doing over the years. So there's still active students there that are continuing along those paths. And in addition, if you want to learn more about Vocal ID, you can go to www.vocalid.co.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely learn more about what Rupal is up to. And Rupal, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a little piece of your story.
Thank you, Marie. My pleasure. And if students or people want to reach out to me, I'm very accessible by email. And so email it either at r.patel@neu.edu or rupal@vocalid.co, depending on your interests. I'm happy to entertain any other questions that people may have.
Perfect. Well, we appreciate that. And listeners, thank you so much for joining us today as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.